At the end of the 19th century, the United States entered a period historians would later call the Gilded Age, an era defined not by equality or stability, but by speed. Railroads expanded faster than laws could restrain them. Industrial capital accumulated faster than society could absorb it, and a small number of families rose to a level of wealth that had no historical precedent in America. This was not money earned slowly or cautiously. It was money organized at scale, converted into influence, and protected through inheritance. Among those families, the name Vanderbilt did not represent ambition or social climbing. It represented arrival. By the 1890s, the Vanderbilt fortune was already secure. Cornelius Vanderbilt had transformed railroads into an empire, and his descendants inherited not only capital, but access, insulation, and authority. George Vanderbilt, the youngest of the family, came of age in a world where financial survival was no longer a concern. What remained was a more abstract question: how does inherited power define itself when it no longer needs to prove anything? As industrial cities like New York grew crowded, volatile, and politically exposed, old money began to look elsewhere, not to escape the nation, but to step beyond its noise. The answer was distance, silence, control. That search led George Vanderbilt to Asheville, North Carolina, a quiet mountain town far removed from factories, stock exchanges, and labor unrest. Asheville produced no great fortunes of its own, but that was precisely its value. It offered seclusion without invisibility, isolation without irrelevance. In this landscape, Vanderbilt envisioned something unprecedented: a private estate, not built to generate wealth, but to embody it. Biltmore was never intended to function as a typical residence. It was designed as a self-contained world, architectural, cultural, and symbolic. Its scale rivaled European chateaux, its landholdings mirrored feudal estates, and its purpose extended far beyond personal comfort. Completed on Christmas night in 1895, Biltmore marked the moment when a dynasty attempted to turn money into permanence and inheritance into legacy. What followed would quietly reveal the limits of even the most carefully constructed power. Chapter 1. The name that already ruled America, long before Biltmore was ever imagined, before its stone walls rose from the mountains of North Carolina. The Vanderbilt name had already secured a position of authority that few families in American history would ever reach, a form of dominance built not on visibility or public admiration, but on control exercised quietly and at scale. The origins of that power traced back to Cornelius Vanderbilt, later known simply as the Commodore, a man who understood earlier than most that transportation was not merely an industry, but a mechanism of influence, capable of shaping cities, labor, commerce, and time itself. And by mastering shipping routes and later railroads, he transformed movement into leverage, and leverage into permanence. By the time of his death in 1877, the Vanderbilt fortune was not just vast by contemporary standards, it was structurally insulated, diversified, and institutionalized, no longer dependent on a single enterprise or individual, and therefore capable of surviving its own creator. What the next generation inherited was not merely capital, but insulation from urgency, from exposure, and from the constant negotiation with risk that defined the American experience for nearly everyone else. The Vanderbilt name required no introduction, no justification, and no defense. Banks recognized it instinctively, politicians accommodated it cautiously, and society adjusted itself around its presence. George Washington Vanderbilt II was born into this environment in 1862, not as an heir expected to expand an empire, but as one expected to exist within it, a distinction that would quietly shape his entire worldview. Unlike industrial heirs driven toward management, accumulation, or public leadership, George Vanderbilt was afforded something rare, even among the wealthy: distance from necessity. He did not need to involve himself in railroads or finance to validate his position, because the fortune functioned independently of his participation, and this freedom redirected his attention away from industry and toward culture, architecture, literature, and European history, forming a sensibility less concerned with growth than with continuity. This distinction mattered because old money does not seek to prove itself through expansion. It seeks legitimacy through endurance, and by the late 19th century, the Vanderbilt dynasty had reached a point where further accumulation offered diminishing symbolic returns. The family's power was already unquestioned, but its future meaning was not. As industrial America accelerated, cities like New York became crowded, volatile, and increasingly exposed to public scrutiny, labor unrest, and political resistance, turning visibility into liability rather than advantage. And families like the Vanderbilts responded not by retreating from influence, but by distancing themselves from its noise. For old money, control was most effective when exercised indirectly, from environments designed to insulate power from consequence, and George Vanderbilt understood this instinctively. As the youngest son, removed from the operational demands of the family empire, he occupied a peculiar position within the dynasty, free to act, yet unnecessary to its survival. That freedom carried its own burden, because when wealth no longer demands participation, it demands definition. George Vanderbilt's challenge was not how to make money, but how to give inherited power a physical and cultural form that suggested inevitability, refinement, and permanence. The answer was never commerce, it was symbolism. Unlike new wealth, which announces itself loudly in search of recognition, old wealth constructs environments that imply authority without explanation. And by the 1890s, the Vanderbilt name had reached the stage where it no longer needed to dominate markets to rule America. It merely needed to endure. In this context, the idea of Biltmore emerged not as indulgence, but as articulation, a deliberate attempt to transform abstract wealth into a tangible expression of dynastic permanence, a structure that could suggest lineage rather than ambition, culture rather than commerce, and stability rather than growth. The house George Vanderbilt would one day commission was never intended to function as a conventional residence, nor even as a display of excess. It was conceived as an institution disguised as a home, a private environment designed to embody the belief that true power should feel timeless, inevitable, and beyond dispute. This was the paradox of the Vanderbilt name at the end of the Gilded Age. It ruled America not through constant expansion, but through restraint, not through public spectacle, but through controlled distance, not through ambition, but through an inheritance already secured. Biltmore would not mark the beginning of that dynasty, because the dynasty required no beginning, but it would become its most deliberate expression, a physical declaration that the Vanderbilt name had moved beyond the mechanics of wealth and into the realm of legacy, unaware that in attempting to make power permanent, it was also exposing the quiet vulnerability that exists at the core of all inherited dominance. Chapter 2. Wealth Without a Center. By the final decades of the 19th century, American wealth had reached a stage where it no longer needed geography to define it, because the fortunes of old money were no longer rooted in a single city, industry, or marketplace, but dispersed across systems that operated everywhere and nowhere at once. Railroads ran through dozens of states, banking interests crossed oceans, and industrial capital moved faster than physical presence could follow, creating a class of wealth that functioned independently of location. For families like the Vanderbilts, money no longer belonged to New York, nor to rail yards, ports, or boardrooms. It existed above them, insulated from their daily instability. This was wealth without a center, power that did not require proximity to function, and therefore had the freedom to choose distance. As industrial cities expanded, they also became exposed, crowded, politically volatile, and increasingly hostile environments for dynastic power, places where labor unrest, reform movements, and public scrutiny converged to make visibility dangerous. Old money learned quickly that proximity to production brought accountability, and accountability threatened permanence. The solution was not retreat, but relocation on its own terms, a strategic withdrawal from the visible mechanics of wealth into environments where power could exist quietly, beyond negotiation. This shift marked a fundamental change in how American dynasties related to space, because once money no longer needed to remain close to factories or transportation hubs, geography became symbolic rather than functional. Locations were chosen not for economic necessity, but for what they represented: control, isolation, and endurance. In this context, places like Asheville, North Carolina, emerged not as centers of wealth creation, but as destinations for wealth already made, landscapes that offered clean air, physical distance, and cultural anonymity without sacrificing relevance. Asheville did not threaten dynastic power because it demanded nothing from it. It had no labor base to manage, no political machine to influence, and no industrial infrastructure to expose. It existed as a blank canvas, a place where wealth could arrive fully formed and remain unchallenged. For George Vanderbilt, this logic was decisive. His fortune did not require him to remain near railroads or financial institutions, because those systems would continue to function regardless of his presence. What he needed was an environment that could contain inherited power without diluting it, a setting where wealth could transform into something quieter and more abstract: legitimacy. Old money does not seek to dominate the present moment. It seeks to control the long view, and that requires distance from the pressures of immediacy. The further wealth moves from its point of origin, the less it must explain itself, and explanation is the enemy of authority. This is why dynastic estates rarely rise at the heart of economic activity. They appear at its margins, in places that seem removed from consequence, where architecture can replace industry as the visible expression of power. In choosing a place like Asheville, George Vanderbilt was not abandoning the centers of American wealth. He was demonstrating that he no longer needed them. His presence there would not generate money, but it would absorb it, converting abstract capital into land, stone, and controlled space. This transformation mattered because wealth that remains mobile is vulnerable to time, markets, and politics, while wealth anchored physically can suggest inevitability, even when its foundations are already eroding. The idea of building far from any traditional center was not eccentric. It was strategic, an acknowledgement that true old money operates best when it is least visible. By the 1890s, the Vanderbilt fortune had reached a stage where it could afford silence, and silence had become the ultimate luxury. The absence of industry, noise, and conflict was not accidental. It was curated, a condition necessary for the illusion of permanence. Wealth without a center does not disappear. It relocates into environments designed to protect it from scrutiny, and in doing so, it begins the slow process of transforming power into memory. This was the spatial logic that made Biltmore possible, because only a fortune no longer tied to a city could imagine building a private world beyond one, a self-contained estate intended not to participate in the economy around it, but to stand apart from it, suggesting that some forms of power no longer needed a place to originate, only a place to endure. Chapter 3: A House Designed to Defy Time. The decision to build Biltmore was never a question of necessity, comfort, or even ambition, but a calculated response to a deeper anxiety shared by old money at the end of the Gilded Age: the fear that wealth, no matter how vast, remained temporary unless it could be translated into something that appeared permanent. By the 1890s, the Vanderbilt fortune had already achieved what most dynasties could only aspire to: insulation from risk, independence from geography, and freedom from the need to expand. Yet those very conditions exposed a new vulnerability, because money that no longer needs to move begins to search for a place to settle, and settlement demands form. For George Vanderbilt, that form would not be another business venture or philanthropic institution, but architecture on a scale rarely attempted in America, a structure intended not to serve time, but to resist it. The house he envisioned was never meant to function as a conventional residence. It was conceived as an environment that could absorb wealth and convert it into legitimacy, transforming capital into stone, land, and controlled space. Elements that implied endurance, even as the economic forces behind them remained volatile. In choosing to construct a chateau-inspired estate deep in the mountains of North Carolina, Vanderbilt was making a statement that extended far beyond personal taste, aligning himself not with American industrialists, but with European aristocratic traditions that measured power not by speed or growth, but by continuity across centuries. Biltmore was designed to suggest lineage rather than innovation, permanence rather than progress, and inevitability rather than success. Its architecture borrowed heavily from French Renaissance forms, not because they were fashionable, but because they carried the visual language of dynasties that had survived revolutions, wars, and economic collapse. And by importing that language into the American landscape, Vanderbilt was attempting to graft his family's relatively young fortune onto the illusion of ancient authority. Every element of the estate reinforced this intention, from its immense scale to its self-sufficiency, because a house designed to defy time could not rely on the systems of the present moment. Biltmore required its own infrastructure, its own labor force, its own rhythms, operating as a closed world insulated from the uncertainties beyond its boundaries. This was not excess for its own sake, but control disguised as grandeur, a deliberate effort to create a space where the future could be managed through design. The construction itself reflected this obsession with permanence, demanding years of labor, thousands of workers, and costs that far exceeded practical justification. Yet such inefficiency was precisely the point, because true old money signals power not through optimization, but through the ability to ignore it. Time was treated as expendable, labor as invisible, and cost as irrelevant, reinforcing the message that the dynasty operating behind the project existed beyond ordinary constraints. Even the location of Biltmore served this logic, rising from a landscape chosen not for productivity, but for isolation, where mountains provided natural barriers against intrusion and change, allowing the estate to appear timeless, even as the nation around it accelerated toward modernity. The house was designed to feel inevitable, as if it had always belonged there, as if its presence were a natural extension of the land, rather than a recent imposition of wealth. Yet this attempt to defeat time revealed an inherent contradiction, because architecture, no matter how monumental, cannot escape the conditions that give it meaning. Biltmore could imitate the symbols of European permanence, but it could not replicate the social structures that sustained them, because American dynastic wealth lacked the historical depth required to make such illusions stable. The house stood as a declaration of intent rather than a guarantee of outcome, asserting that the Vanderbilt name could transcend the volatility of markets by anchoring itself physically, culturally, and aesthetically. In doing so, it transformed wealth into memory before memory was required, preserving a moment of dominance at its peak rather than adapting to its decline. A house designed to defy time is ultimately a house built in response to it, and Biltmore's grandeur concealed a quiet admission that even the most powerful dynasties sensed the limits of their endurance. The estate did not emerge from confidence alone, but from an awareness that power, once secured, must be preserved against forces it can no longer control, and in attempting to freeze authority into stone, George Vanderbilt revealed the central tension of old money America. that permanence must be constructed precisely because it does not come naturally. Biltmore would stand as the most complete expression of that belief, a structure intended to outlast generations, markets, and memory itself, even as the conditions that made it possible were already beginning to erode. Chapter 4. The Cost of Permanence. The ambition to make permanence visible came with a price that extended far beyond money, because the true cost of Biltmore was not measured only in stone, steel, or land, but in time, labor, and human invisibility, all expended to sustain the illusion that permanence could be purchased. Once George Vanderbilt committed to building a house designed to defy time, the project ceased to resemble construction and began to function as an industrial operation in itself, absorbing resources on a scale rarely associated with a private residence. Thousands of workers were drawn into the mountains of North Carolina, carving roads where none had existed, shaping terrain that resisted alteration, and transforming a remote landscape into a controlled environment capable of supporting an architectural fantasy imported from Europe. These men did not build a dream. They built infrastructure for someone else's legacy, laboring under conditions defined by urgency and excess rather than comfort or efficiency. Time was treated as an obstacle to be conquered rather than respected, and deadlines were imposed not because they were practical, but because the appearance of inevitability required momentum. The estate demanded materials sourced from across the country and beyond, stone quarried on site, timber harvested relentlessly from surrounding forests, and architectural elements shipped vast distances to satisfy a vision that refused compromise. Nothing about Biltmore was optimized, because optimization implies limitation, and limitation threatened the very symbolism the house was meant to project. To signal permanence, the project had to appear indifferent to cost, delay, and waste, reinforcing the idea that the dynasty behind it existed outside the economic constraints governing ordinary life. Yet this indifference carried consequences. The surrounding land was stripped and reshaped, forests cleared to supply lumber and open vistas, ecosystems altered to conform to aesthetic preference rather than sustainability, leaving scars disguised as order. Laborers lived temporarily and anonymously, their contributions absorbed into the estate without recognition, because permanence requires forgetting those who make it possible. Even as the house rose, the financial demands of maintaining such scale became apparent, revealing a contradiction at the heart of old money ambition. Structures built to last forever require constant expenditure to remain convincing. Biltmore did not simply exist, it consumed, drawing wealth inward to sustain its image of stability, and in doing so, it exposed how permanence is never static, but endlessly costly. The Vanderbilt fortune could absorb these demands in the short term, but the long-term implications were unavoidable, because every acre acquired, every room completed, and every system installed created future obligations rather than security. The estate required staff to operate, resources to maintain, and capital to preserve appearances, turning permanence into a continuous performance rather than a settled condition. What appeared timeless from a distance was, in practice, fragile, dependent on uninterrupted flows of money, labor, and attention. This reality underscored a deeper truth about dynastic power at the end of the Gilded Age, that wealth could build monuments, but it could not eliminate dependency. The house that was meant to stand above time became increasingly vulnerable to it, because time introduced costs that no design could fully anticipate. Economic conditions shifted, public sentiment toward concentrated wealth hardened, and the systems that had once insulated old money began to erode under taxation, regulation, and social change. Biltmore's scale, once its greatest strength, quietly transformed into its greatest liability, because what had been built to symbolize permanence now demanded justification. The estate's grandeur required explanation in a world growing less tolerant of excess and explanation weakens authority. The cost of permanence was not merely financial, it was symbolic, eroding the aura of inevitability the house was designed to project. By the time Biltmore neared completion, the seeds of its future vulnerability were already embedded in its foundations, because permanence achieved through accumulation rather than integration cannot adapt easily to change. The house stood as a testament to what old money could command at its peak, but also as evidence of what it would struggle to defend as conditions shifted. Every stone placed to resist time also fixed the dynasty in a moment that could not last, turning permanence into a static ideal rather than a living one. In this way, the cost of Biltmore was paid not only by those who built it, but by the very dynasty it sought to immortalize, binding its identity to a structure that required endless justification to remain relevant. What was intended as protection against decline quietly became a catalyst for it, because permanence, once constructed, must be constantly defended, and defense is the first sign that power no longer feels secure. Chapter 5. Christmas Night, 1895. Christmas night 1895 arrived not as a celebration of warmth or intimacy, but as a carefully staged moment of arrival, the precise instant when Biltmore was meant to cross the threshold from construction to destiny, from ambition to fact. After years of relentless labor, expenditure without restraint, and a vision pursued with almost ritualistic discipline, the house finally opened its doors, illuminated against the dark Blue Ridge Mountains, like a declaration carved into the landscape. This was not merely the completion of a residence, it was the public unveiling of a belief that wealth, when properly translated into architecture, could achieve permanence, legitimacy, and historical weight. George Vanderbilt chose Christmas not for sentimentality, but for symbolism, because Christmas carries the language of birth, renewal, and inevitability. And on that night, Biltmore was meant to be born fully formed, without precedent, without rival, and without apology. Guests arrived to a house that felt less inhabited than consecrated, its vast rooms echoing with the controlled stillness of something designed to endure rather than adapt, its scale immediately asserting that this was not a place for ordinary human rhythms. Everything about the evening reinforced hierarchy and distance, from the orchestration of movement through the house to the subtle reminder that comfort was secondary to impression. Biltmore did not invite intimacy, it imposed awe. For the Vanderbilt dynasty, the evening represented a moment of absolute confidence, when the mechanisms of wealth appeared perfectly aligned with its expression, and the future seemed sufficiently predictable to justify such finality. Yet beneath the ceremony and precision, Christmas night also marked a quiet transition, because once a monument declares itself complete, it becomes vulnerable to time in a way that ambition never is. The house stood finished, but the conditions that had made it possible were already shifting beyond its walls. Industrial America was entering a new phase, one less forgiving of concentrated wealth, more attentive to inequality, taxation, and public accountability. The same forces that had allowed fortunes like the Vanderbilts to expand unchecked were beginning to attract resistance, and resistance introduces uncertainty, the very thing Biltmore was designed to exclude. On that night, none of this was acknowledged because dynastic power rarely recognizes its own limits at the moment of its greatest expression. Instead, the house functioned as proof, not only to outsiders but to its creators, that the dynasty had successfully elevated itself beyond the volatility of markets and politics, anchoring its authority in stone, land, and controlled space. Yet the stillness of Christmas night concealed an irony that would only become visible with time, that permanence, once achieved, transforms power from a process into a position, and positions must be defended. The house that glowed with assurance also froze the dynasty in a particular moment, preserving an image of dominance that could not evolve without contradiction. What had been built to transcend time now had to survive it. Biltmore's completion did not signal the beginning of a new era for the Vanderbilt family. It marked the closing of one, the final moment when expansion, confidence, and insulation aligned perfectly enough to justify such excess. From that night forward, the house would no longer be a project, but a burden disguised as triumph, demanding maintenance, explanation, and relevance in a world that was already moving past the conditions that created it. Christmas night 1895 is remembered as a moment of arrival, but its deeper significance lies in what it quietly concluded, because in declaring itself finished, Biltmore also declared that the dynasty behind it had reached its peak. The silence that settled over the estate after the guests departed was not merely the calm of completion, it was the stillness that follows culmination. The pause before decline begins its slow, orderly advance. In the glow of that winter night, surrounded by grandeur designed to last forever, the Vanderbilt dynasty unknowingly crossed the invisible line between ascent and preservation, between power in motion and power standing still, and history would prove that stillness, no matter how magnificent, is never neutral. Chapter 6. Life Inside an American Dynasty. Life inside Biltmore did not resemble the warmth or spontaneity commonly associated with domestic space, because the house was never designed to serve ordinary human needs, but to reinforce hierarchy, distance, and continuity, the defining traits of an American dynasty that no longer needed to explain itself. From the moment daily life settled into the estate, it became clear that Biltmore functioned less as a home than as a controlled environment, where movement, interaction, and even leisure were shaped by structure rather than choice. Rooms were vast and carefully ordered, not to invite intimacy, but to remind occupants of scale, lineage, and expectation. And every corridor reinforced the quiet understanding that individuals existed in service to something larger than themselves. For George Vanderbilt, daily life was defined by routine and restraint rather than indulgence, because old money does not celebrate excess openly. It normalizes it until it becomes invisible. Meals followed strict patterns, social interactions adhered to unspoken rules, and privacy was preserved not through isolation, but through layers of staff and protocol that ensured the family remained insulated from the mechanics of their own wealth. Servants moved silently, labor was constant yet unseen, and the infrastructure of comfort operated in the background, allowing the appearance of effortlessness to persist. This invisibility was essential, because dynastic power depends on the illusion that stability exists naturally, without intervention. The rhythms of life at Biltmore reflected this philosophy, with days structured around cultural pursuits, reading, correspondence, and curated social gatherings rather than commerce or management, reinforcing the idea that the dynasty had progressed beyond the need for participation in economic life. Guests were welcomed selectively, often from similar circles of inherited privilege, ensuring that interaction occurred within a closed ecosystem where assumptions went unchallenged and continuity felt inevitable. Yet beneath this controlled calm lay a subtle form of confinement, because a life shaped entirely by inheritance leaves little room for deviation without consequence. Expectations were omnipresent but rarely articulated, shaping behavior through implication rather than command, and individuality was permitted only insofar as it did not disrupt the image of stability. For members of an American dynasty, freedom was abundant in theory, but constrained in practice, because deviation threatened not personal reputation, but the coherence of the family's identity. Biltmore amplified this dynamic by its sheer scale, which demanded constant coordination and maintenance, tying daily life to the preservation of appearances. The estate required attention not as a place of living, but as a symbol that could not be allowed to deteriorate, and this responsibility quietly redefined domestic life as stewardship rather than enjoyment. Over time, the house itself became the dominant presence, shaping the habits and priorities of those within it, because living inside a monument means existing within a narrative already written. The very isolation that protected the dynasty from external pressures also intensified its inward focus, creating an environment where tradition carried more weight than adaptation, and continuity was valued over relevance. This inwardness, while stabilizing in the short term, limited the family's ability to respond to change, because life inside an American dynasty is designed to preserve what already exists, not to prepare for what comes next. As years passed, the routines that once signaled confidence began to resemble rigidity, and the silence that defined Biltmore's daily life grew heavier, not emptier, as the world beyond the estate accelerated toward modernity. The Vanderbilt family did not experience decline suddenly or dramatically. It unfolded quietly within these walls, through habits that resisted change and expectations that no longer aligned with reality. Life inside Biltmore revealed the paradox of dynastic power at its peak, that insulation from struggle also insulates from adaptation, and a house built to protect legacy can slowly become the space where relevance begins to fade. Chapter 7. The Inheritance Problem. The greatest vulnerability of any dynasty is not external pressure or public scandal, but succession, because inherited power assumes continuity while history rarely cooperates. For the Vanderbilt family, the problem of inheritance was never about the absence of wealth, but about the transfer of meaning, responsibility, and relevance from one generation to the next. George Vanderbilt had built Biltmore as a monument to permanence, yet permanence required heirs capable not only of maintaining assets, but of understanding the social and economic logic that had produced them. Unlike his industrial predecessors, George did not train successors through competition or enterprise. Instead, the family's wealth had reached a level where direct involvement in creation was no longer necessary, leaving future generations to inherit outcomes without experiencing process. This separation between wealth and effort created a subtle fracture at the heart of the dynasty, because inheritance, without participation, weakens the sense of obligation that sustains long-term stewardship. Within Biltmore, succession became a matter of legal transition rather than cultural transmission, with property, titles, and expectations passing forward without the lived experience that once justified them. The estate itself complicated this transition, because it was too large to function as a normal inheritance and too symbolic to be treated as a liquid asset. Maintaining Biltmore required resources, coordination, and a commitment to preservation that few heirs could sustain indefinitely, especially as economic conditions shifted and social attitudes toward inherited wealth hardened. Each generation faced the same dilemma, whether to preserve the house as a living symbol of dynastic continuity or to adapt, divide, or relinquish parts of it in order to remain solvent. Yet adaptation carried its own cost, because altering Biltmore risked undermining the very narrative of permanence it was meant to embody. This tension transformed inheritance from a privilege into a burden, as heirs inherited not only wealth, but a responsibility to uphold an image increasingly detached from modern reality. The cultural environment that had once celebrated grand estates began to view them as relics of excess, and the Vanderbilt name, once synonymous with progress and dominance, became associated with a past that no longer aligned with contemporary values. Inside the family, expectations persisted without adjustment, reinforcing behavioral patterns shaped by an earlier era, while the external world demanded flexibility, transparency, and relevance. This mismatch intensified the inheritance problem, because each successive generation was asked to preserve a structure designed for a society that no longer existed. The legal mechanisms of inheritance could transfer ownership, but they could not transfer conviction. And without conviction, stewardship became performative rather than purposeful. Over time, the act of inheriting Biltmore ceased to represent opportunity and instead signified obligation, tying heirs to maintenance costs, public scrutiny, and historical expectations they did not choose. The estate's size magnified every hesitation, because indecision at such a scale translated into financial strain, deferred upkeep, and gradual erosion of control. Unlike businesses that could evolve or dissolve, Biltmore resisted graceful transition, forcing each generation to confront the same unresolved question: whether legacy should be preserved at all costs or allowed to change, even if that change diluted its original meaning. The Vanderbilt dynasty encountered the quiet truth that inheritance does not guarantee continuity, and that the structures built to outlast individuals can outlive the values that once sustained them. As time passed, the problem of inheritance revealed itself not as a single moment of failure, but as a slow accumulation of compromises, each one necessary, yet collectively transformative. In this way, Biltmore became a case study in dynastic fragility, demonstrating that the transfer of wealth is simple compared to the transfer of purpose, and that a house designed to endure centuries can still struggle to survive a single generational shift. Chapter 8: When the Money Stopped Flowing. For a dynasty built on the assumption of endless resources, the most destabilizing moment is not loss, but interruption, because old money is structured around continuity rather than crisis. At Biltmore, the moment the money stopped flowing was not marked by bankruptcy or public collapse, but by a gradual realization that the mechanisms sustaining the estate were no longer self-renewing. The Vanderbilt fortune had been created through expansion, consolidation, and aggressive participation in a rapidly industrializing America. But by the early 20th century, the conditions that once rewarded scale and dominance had begun to change. Regulation tightened, markets matured, and the extraordinary returns that fueled the family's ascent became increasingly difficult to replicate. Wealth that had once grown through momentum now depended on preservation, and preservation, unlike expansion, produces no surplus energy. The estate continued to function, but its operation became increasingly defensive, with resources directed toward maintenance rather than growth. Biltmore required constant expenditure to preserve its image of effortless permanence, yet those expenditures no longer translated into renewed financial strength. The illusion of stability persisted only because the estate had been designed to conceal strain, absorbing financial pressure into its vast infrastructure without visible disruption. However, beneath this surface calm, the balance had shifted. Costs were fixed, revenues were finite, and the margin for error narrowed with each passing year. The money did not disappear. It simply lost its capacity to regenerate itself at the scale required to sustain a private kingdom. This shift altered the psychology of ownership, because old money derives confidence from abundance, not adequacy. When abundance fades, every decision acquires weight, and every indulgence begins to resemble liability. Within the Vanderbilt family, this change was subtle but profound, reshaping attitudes toward the estate and redefining what inheritance actually meant. Biltmore was no longer a passive expression of wealth. It became an active demand on diminishing resources, requiring strategic choices that the dynasty had never needed to make before. The estate's agricultural operations, once envisioned as self-sustaining, struggled to offset operational costs, and cultural patronage, once a symbol of refinement, became increasingly difficult to justify. As external economic shocks, wars, market downturns, and shifting tax structures compressed margins further, the estate's financial model revealed its fragility. What had once been a rational display of dominance now appeared increasingly misaligned with a modern economy that favored liquidity, diversification, and adaptability. The Vanderbilt name still carried weight, but name alone could not generate cash flow, and prestige proved insufficient as a financial instrument. This disconnect forced a reckoning, because maintaining the appearance of permanence required sacrifices that eroded the very autonomy the estate was meant to protect. Portions of land were sold, operations were scaled back, and the idea of Biltmore as a purely private domain began to weaken, not through ideological change, but through necessity. The money had not stopped entirely, but it had lost its excess, and without excess, the dynasty's margin for preservation vanished. This moment marked a transition from ownership defined by confidence to ownership defined by management, a shift that undermined the cultural logic of old money itself. The Vanderbilt family found themselves confronting a reality their ancestors had never faced, that wealth, once accumulated, does not guarantee permanence unless it continues to evolve. Biltmore, built to stand outside the fluctuations of history, was now subject to them, exposed not by scandal or ruin, but by arithmetic. When the money stopped flowing as it once had, the estate's silence grew heavier, because it signaled not failure, but the end of inevitability. In that quiet recalibration, the dynasty crossed an invisible threshold, moving from dominance into preservation, and from preservation into uncertainty, revealing that even the most carefully constructed symbols of permanence are vulnerable when the financial current beneath them slows to a crawl. Chapter 9. The House Without a Dynasty. A house conceived to anchor a lineage becomes something fundamentally different when that lineage no longer occupies it with authority, and Biltmore entered this final stage not through abandonment or destruction, but through the quiet disappearance of purpose. The Vanderbilt dynasty did not fall in a single generation, nor did it collapse under scandal or disgrace. It simply ceased to function as a ruling presence within the walls built to immortalize it. The estate remained intact, meticulously maintained, and outwardly unchanged, yet the social gravity that once defined it slowly evaporated. Without a living dynasty actively shaping its rhythms, Biltmore transitioned from a private seat of power into a managed structure, preserved not for continuity, but for remembrance. The architecture continued to impose scale, hierarchy, and order, but those qualities no longer served a commanding will. Hallways once designed to reinforce separation now guided movement without consequence, and rooms built to assert dominance over time stood silent, impressive yet inert. The estate no longer organized life around itself, it waited, suspended between relevance and memory. This absence transformed Biltmore's relationship with authority, because power once derived from exclusivity was replaced by legitimacy constructed through interpretation. The house no longer demanded respect through distance. It attracted attention through accessibility, converting inherited grandeur into curated experience. As the dynasty receded, stewardship replaced sovereignty, and decisions were driven not by legacy-building ambition, but by sustainability, liability, and institutional preservation. The estate survived by surrendering the very condition that had justified its creation, accepting that endurance now required openness rather than control. The system sustaining Biltmore shifted outward, relying on administration, tourism, and historical framing rather than family conviction, effectively transferring ownership of meaning from lineage to public narrative. This transformation preserved the physical structure while severing its original function, because a house without a dynasty cannot operate as a seat of power, only as a record of one. The silence that settled over Biltmore was not emptiness, but containment, the stillness of a place no longer generating history, only holding it. Movement through the estate became interpretive rather than participatory, with every space framed as evidence of a concluded era rather than a living hierarchy. Visitors encountered rooms once restricted to insiders, but what they encountered was not authority, only its residue, carefully contextualized and controlled. The absence of a ruling family exposed how much of Biltmore's power had always depended on belief, rather than permanence, on the assumption that those who built it would always exist to justify its scale. Once that assumption dissolved, the architecture remained extraordinary but no longer self-evident, requiring explanation to prevent it from appearing excessive rather than inevitable. Over time, the estate's survival strategy revealed the final contradiction of dynastic architecture, that buildings designed to outlast individuals still rely on living structures of power to remain relevant. Without succession, continuity becomes performance, and legacy becomes static. Biltmore endured precisely because it abandoned its original role, allowing itself to be redefined as cultural memory rather than private dominion. The Vanderbilt name persisted as reference, but no longer as command, functioning as historical label rather than organizing force. In this state, the house became timeless in appearance, but fixed in meaning, frozen at the moment its dynasty effectively ended. The estate no longer shaped identity or future. It illustrated a past that could not be revived. In becoming a house without a dynasty, Biltmore did not fail or decay. It completed its intended arc, transforming from an assertion of permanence into a quiet testament to the limits of inheritance. Stone endured, wealth lingered, design remained flawless, but the living authority required to animate them was gone, leaving behind a structure that survived history only by stepping aside from it. Chapter 10. A legacy carefully preserved. Legacy is often imagined as something that survives naturally, carried forward by name, wealth, and structure. But at Biltmore, legacy endured only because it was deliberately managed, constrained, and redefined. Once the Vanderbilt dynasty ceased to function as an active ruling presence, the estate faced a choice that all monuments of inherited power eventually confront: to decay in private irrelevance or to survive through controlled exposure. Biltmore chose preservation, not as a continuation of authority, but as a careful reframing of it. The house was no longer asked to dominate the future. It was tasked with representing the past. This transition required discipline rather than ambition, replacing dynastic confidence with institutional caution. Every aspect of the estate's continued existence became subject to evaluation. What could be shown, what must be protected, and what narrative should be allowed to define it. Preservation demanded restraint, because unfiltered access would dilute meaning, while total closure would erase relevance. The solution was balance, a curated openness that transformed private power into public memory without surrendering control. In this form, Biltmore became a managed legacy rather than a living one, sustained not by belief in inevitability, but by deliberate maintenance. The estate's survival depended on interpretation, with history carefully organized into a coherent narrative that emphasized craftsmanship, culture, and continuity, while softening the harsher realities of concentration, exclusion, and excess. This was not deception, but selection, the same process through which all legacies are preserved. By choosing what to highlight and what to quiet, Biltmore ensured that its past remained intelligible rather than controversial, impressive rather than indicting. The architecture remained unchanged, but its function evolved, shifting from assertion to illustration. Visitors were no longer expected to submit to hierarchy. They were invited to observe it. The estate no longer enforced silence through authority. It inspired it through scale and design. In doing so, Biltmore maintained its presence without reclaiming its power, achieving longevity through adaptation rather than dominance. This form of preservation revealed a deeper truth about old money, that survival does not depend on expansion, but on control over narrative. The Vanderbilt legacy endured not because its original conditions persisted, but because its symbols could be repurposed for a different audience and a different era. The house stood intact, not as proof that the dynasty had won against time, but as evidence that it had negotiated with it. In preserving Biltmore, caretakers preserved an idea of permanence stripped of its original authority, allowing the estate to exist as cultural artifact rather than political force. The legacy was no longer dynamic. It was stabilized, protected from erosion by being fixed in meaning. This careful preservation came at a cost, because a legacy maintained too precisely cannot evolve, only endure. Biltmore became timeless in appearance, but finite in interpretation, frozen at the point where private power yielded to public history. Yet this limitation was also its strength, ensuring survival in a society increasingly skeptical of inherited dominance. The estate did not argue for relevance, it offered context. It did not demand admiration, it invited reflection. In this final form, Biltmore achieved a quieter kind of permanence, one grounded not in authority, but in acknowledgement. The house remained, not because the dynasty continued, but because the story was worth keeping. And in that careful preservation, Biltmore completed its transformation from a symbol of American ascendancy into a controlled memory of it, standing not as a promise of what legacy can guarantee, but as a reminder of how carefully it must be maintained once the power that created it is gone.